Hugo Boss is a fashion brand associated with wealth, elegance, and status, and is worn by countless prominent celebrities. But this fashion icon has done all it can to hide its dark past from the public eye. This is the story of how Hugo Boss supported Hitler, made the uniforms for the Nazis, and yet somehow cleansed its image and built a global fashion empire. Hugo Boss was born in Germany in 1885 in a town known for its textile industry. In fact, Hugo's parents owned a modest lingerie shop, and thus Hugo himself developed an interest in fashion from an early age. As a teen, he took jobs that would help him understand the ins and outs of the industry. He initially began an apprenticeship as a merchant, then worked in a textile mill, before eventually taking over his parents' lingerie shop. However, soon after World War I broke out, Hugo took the opportunity to serve his country. And whilst Hugo survived the war, he returned with a new vision of what he wanted to do with his life. Rather than running his parents' small shop, he wanted to create his own fashion company, and thus he transformed the shop into a tailor's that he named after himself. Since Hugo had been gaining experience from such a young age, it only took him a couple of years before he was able to turn his shop into a whole factory. And he began selling his own brand of jackets, shirts, workwear, sportswear, and raincoats. His previous apprenticeship had made Hugo a great salesman, and before long, the company's clothing became fairly well known around Germany. However, one of the consequences of World War I was that Germany had been ordered to pay the winning countries a huge amount of money in reparations. The debt was set at 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent of about 270 billion US dollars in today's currency. This began to cripple the German economy and set the stage for an extremely tough and grueling era, as the US, UK, and France enjoyed extravagant spending on behalf of Germany's debt. A time known in America as the Roaring Twenties, Germany struggled to pay off the war while having enough to support their own country. As a result, German citizens saw high inflation and business closures, and therefore, even though Hugo Boss's clothing had been pretty popular, his company began to suffer. No amount of good reputation could help the fact that people were struggling to afford his work. And then, the Great Depression only made Germany's bleak economic situation even worse. Food became scarce, jobs were nowhere to be found, and some families even burnt their money to provide heat during the harsh winters. In an effort to try and save his business, Hugo began making uniforms for the German police and other government officials. Unfortunately, this was not enough, and Hugo was forced to lay off most of his workforce and shut down his factory. Eventually, he filed for bankruptcy, and all Hugo was left with was 6 sewing machines. It seemed like the Hugo Boss clothing brand would be nothing but a short-lived dream. Germany was in a desperate situation, and they were willing to seek help from anyone. It was during this time that Adolf Hitler rose to power. But for Hugo Boss, he saw this as an opportunity. He knew that those close to the Nazi party were eligible for government contracts, and thus he became a proud supporter of the Nazis, and an active member of the Nazi party from 1931 onward. Hugo made connections with high-ranking members within the party, and he knew this would make him a prime candidate to produce the newly designed Nazi uniforms. And it worked. Hugo managed to build connections with them and eventually won a contract to begin producing their uniforms. So with only 6 sewing machines, Hugo got to work. And at first, this was just making the Nazi uniforms. For example, one of his first big contracts was to supply brown shirts to the Nazis. But as the party grew into power, they required more uniforms. For example, for soldiers, the police, and the Hitler Youth. And Hugo's connections to the Nazis meant he was manufacturing uniforms for all of these. Of course, to meet the growing demand, 6 sewing machines wasn't enough. He needed lots more equipment and employees, so Hugo Boss took out loans to expand his company so he could grow his tailoring operation and create all the different uniforms and outfits the Nazis needed. And from a financial perspective, Hugo Boss's allegiance to Hitler paid off massively. He was making way more money than his business ever had before. And as Hitler began his conquest of Europe, Hugo Boss was soon given help through the use of French and Polish forced laborers. So Hugo Boss has slave laborers working in his factory, producing uniforms for the Nazi party and in the SS. Unlike some German business owners at the time, Hugo did at least allow his new slave workers to eat in the canteen rather than the work camps, and he reportedly made sure they were always fed. But on the flip side, it's also reported these workers lived in extremely poor conditions, and that Hugo would threaten to send them to concentration camps if they fell behind on their work. Now, as for Hugo Boss's personal beliefs, it's clear that him so publicly being an active member of the Nazi Party was partially a strategic decision. Remember, before Hitler rose to power and Hugo built an alliance with the Nazis to win those contracts, Hugo's business had collapsed and he was in a terrible financial situation with very little hopes of any success. However, a researcher who wrote a book on Hugo Boss concluded it is clear that Hugo F. Boss did not only join the party because it led to contracts for uniform production, but also because he was a follower of National Socialism and a loyal Nazi. It's reported that in his apartment, he even proudly hung a photo of himself with Hitler. So whilst he may have partially got involved with them to save his business, he seemingly would have supported them regardless. Thankfully though, when the war finally ended and the Nazis were defeated, Hugo Boss was investigated. And because Hugo Boss was found to be an activist and financial beneficiary of the Nazi Party, he was banned from owning a business. Just a couple of years later, in 1948, Hugo Boss died. And so you would think the company bearing his name would die along with him, but of course, we all know that's not the case. In present day, Hugo Boss is a multi-billion-dollar clothing empire. So, what happened? After Hugo Boss's death, what very little was left of the company went to his son-in-law, Eugen Holy, who kept the business going by producing uniforms for the police and postal workers. Although the sale of uniforms kept the business afloat, the Hugo Boss brand became a shell of its former self, as of course they no longer had those lucrative Nazi contracts. It wasn't until the early 1950s that the Hugo Boss company was tasked with producing an order of suits. This was the major turning point for the business. The suits they created seemed very popular, and Eugen realized there could be an opportunity here to rebrand the company and distance it from its dark past. So he began taking more suit orders, and to try and build a good reputation, Eugen ensured the suits were elegant and made with very high quality materials. Although this was expensive, Eugen's decision to make high profile suits paid off, because the Hugo Boss brand moved from being just a uniform brand to a true German fashion tailor, and thus Hugo Boss quickly became a popular brand for men in Germany wanting stylish suits. Under the management of Hugo's son-in-law, Hugo Boss became a bigger business than it had been back when the original founder Hugo had been running it as a tailoring business. Of course, the company tried their best to keep their original founders' political views and activism as private as they could, as they knew it would be disastrous PR if everyone knew the truth. But it was a constant ongoing battle to try and distance themselves from their founder and how much money he'd made from supporting Hitler. However, in 1969, Eugen retired and handed the business off to his two sons, meaning the company was now in its third generation of ownership. And these two brothers were even more ambitious than their father. They were determined to make the company into a global fashion icon.
Any of you that know a little bit about history and fashion will know that Hugo Boss made the uniforms for the Nazis. And the Nazis did have flaws, but you know, they did look f***ing fantastic, let's face it.
How many of the giant fashion brands we know today have such dark histories? If you haven't yet seen the story of these companies here, honestly, it's pretty shocking. So go check them out now, and I'll see you there in a second. Thanks for watching. Cheers.